Hello, my name is Carlo Castillo, and today we're going to be talking about the evolution of language. What is the evolution of language? And a better question, why does it matter? It matters because if human evolution is true, then the evolution of language can tell us much more about this complexity. But it also matters because if human evolution is false, then what does the evolution of language tell us about the opposite worldview? So today we're first going to learn about the evolution of language, what the evidence for that is, and then we're going to delve into a fundamental question: does the evolution of language support human evolution? But why approach it from this perspective? If science relies heavy on concrete evidence, then we must expect the same agenda when talking about linguistics. So without further ado, let's do it. The first point, what is the evolution of language? According to National Geographic, they quote, "Over thousands of years, humans have developed a wide variety of systems to assign specific meanings to sounds, forming words, and systems of grammar to create languages. Many languages developed written forms using symbols to visually record their meaning. Language is a complex form that takes time to develop. Many languages have died out due to political reasons, while others have survived and sounded differently. Along with this, the meaning of words has also changed. For example, the word pray in the Old English simply meant to ask somebody. Nowadays, we tend to associate this word as pertaining to a deity alone. What does this say? Whether you view the world from a religious or naturalistic perspective, the evolution of language is intriguing as it is evident that amongst human beings, language definitely has changed. But how can we study this from a rationalistic view? Here is where linguistics enters the chat. According to a National Geographic Society, they quote, "Linguistics uses the scientific method to conduct research to determine the history and functions of language. They use these characteristics to trace human language back to its origins to get a sense of history and development over time and space. Through linguistics, we can trace back the modern English language back to its origins. We can even explain how it's changed, and more fundamental, why it's changed. In fact, we have already done that with a complex language known as Indo-European. This language gave rise to multiple spoken languages in both Europe and Asia." According to the same National Geographic Society, they say, "Over the years, linguistics have identified and organized several hundred Indo-European languages into branches of a vast linguistic family tree, all originating in the Indo-European proto-language." Now you might be wondering, Carlo, this is all cool, but it doesn't tell me much about how language evolved. Well, what do you mean? If you're wondering how language changes over time, then we've covered that. But if your question asks about where exactly language came from, then tune in for this. First and foremost, I want to be completely honest. There is no concrete evidence to suggest that any language came before the first recorded human language. However, linguistics use comparative methods to reconstruct proto-languages. But these reconstructions are number one, hypothetical, and number two, based on linguistic similarities among related languages rather than direct evidence. So if you Google something like, what is the oldest reconstructed language, and Google gives you something like Proto-Afro-Asiatic, tracing it back to 15,000 years ago, just know that this is only a hypothetical lacking direct evidence. However, there are also reasons to explain why there's no direct evidence, such as the lack of written records due to everything being transmitted orally. But this in itself poses a few questions, such as, how would you know that there was even a spoken language if there's no written documents? The agent would be making an appeal to silence, which is when someone claims that a premise is true or false based on the absence of evidence or testimony, rather than on the presence of positive evidence or logical reasoning. Not to bore you with any philosophical terminology, but it's important that you know the truth of the argument before defending it, whether you come from a religious or naturalistic perspective. Now that we've understood that there is no concrete evidence to suggest that anything came before the first recorded language, let's talk about quote-unquote the language of the animal kingdom. The first piece of evidence we find comes from Ahana Fernandez in the Smithsonian website titled, "Similar to human babies, this bat species learns to communicate through babbling and vocal imitation." In this article, we read, "Just like baby humans, instance, Balinese pups babble as part of their initial language learning stage. They both share the same main features, including reduplication, which is the repetition of syllables, and rhythmicity, which is babbling bouts with a regular beat. Much like human beings, baby bats also spend a great deal of their day either babbling, nursing, or resting attached to their mothers. If human evolution is true, what would this suggest? What conclusions can be drawn from this research? Can we even draw a conclusion to human evolution? According to Fernandez, the parallels between the vocal development of S. balinata and humans may offer valuable insights for biolinguistic studies around the evolution of human language. However, if you're skeptical about this particular study, there's other evidence to suggest that Neanderthals could actually speak. According to Stephen Mythen, professor of early prehistory at the University of Reading, says, new anatomical evidence indicates that Neanderthals had vocal tracts and auditory pathways not significantly different to our own, indicating that, from an anatomical perspective, they were as capable as us at communicating through speech. This is indeed remarkable evidence where solid conclusions can be made. If Neanderthals could talk, then it would be fair to theorize that human language evolves from a shared common ancestor with Neanderthals. It's just probable that humans evolved with a better brain structure that allowed for complex communications as opposed to other species. There's also other evidence to support this theory, given that apes themselves in modern day can talk, but they just don't have the brains to do it. According to Jacob Dunn in an op-ed under Sapiens, he writes, comparative studies have shown that the form and function of the larynx and vocal tract is very similar across most primate species, but most species don't have the neural control to make the complex sounds that compromise human speech. Again, this would only support the theory that humans evolved with a more complex language because we had the ability to do so as opposed to other species, but this in itself isn't concrete evidence to answer where human language comes from. Some unanswered fundamental questions are, how was the first human language like? Was it complex or was it simple? And how would we even determine this from an objective standpoint? Okay, we've covered what the evolution of language is and how it's studied from a linguistic perspective. We have also uncovered the research among other species that have some form of communication and drawn parallels to that of the human language. Furthermore, we've been objective in specifying that there is no concrete evidence to answer where human language came from. So now what? What can we do with this? What's the next step? I wanted to study this from a different approach and study the first recorded human language, Basal Hebrew. If you've studied the historicity of language, you probably want to strangle me right now because there is actually another language that is commonly debated among scholars to be the actual oldest human language, Sumerian. However, there is also evidence to suggest that Basal Hebrew predates Sumerian. According to Dr. Mark Koehne, professor of theology at Aquinas High School, he highlights two significant discoveries that challenge the acceptance of the Sumerian language. He mentions a Canaanite inscriptions from 13 BC and a Hebraic inscription from the 13th through 14th century BC. What he concludes is that these findings suggest a revision of the biblical Exodus timeline to the 15th century BC, which challenges contemporary scholarship. He also argues that Egyptian hieroglyphics predating Hebrew influenced early Hebrew writing, which may have stemmed from the Hebrew's timeline in Egypt. He also posits that Sumerian had ties to Hebrew, suggesting the earlier foundational Basal Hebrew language. He argues that the Genesis narrative linguistic structure supports this, indicating that Hebrew was the original language of divine revelation influencing Sumerian mythology. Now, whether you want to accept that Basal Hebrew or Sumerian was the first recorded human language is solely up to you. The reason why I brought these two up, however, is because of their complexity and relation to biblical accounts. Given that they're the first recorded human languages, one would expect them to be simple, easy to comprehend because, again, they're the first and oldest recorded human languages. However, the outstanding evidence suggests that these two languages were not at all simple, but actually very complex. It's difficult to imagine that such complex languages with rich morphological structures that are root-based on their word formations, meaning that its words are built from roots consisting of 3 consonants, including different patterns of vowels and affixes that create various meanings and grammatical forms, could be the first recorded human language. Me with my philosophical brain, I can't bear to ask, if these languages were so complex in their structure, surely they must have evolved from another language that wasn't so complex, but still left some forms of writing that we could study. But there isn't any. It literally feels like these languages just pop up in human history with no concrete evidence to even support the arguments that another language came beforehand. Look, I'll be honest, as a devout Catholic myself, I may have some rooted biases in this argument. My opinion may or may not hold any value to you, but what about the viewpoint of atheists? Noam Chomsky, a renowned linguistic and cognitive scientist, says, the evolution of language over the millennia leaves no fossils, no physical traces of its development. We can make educated guesses, but we should be wary of those who claim to have a clear picture of how it happened. Philip Lieberman, a cognitive scientist and linguistic, says, the archaeological record is silent on the topic of the very first languages. We can infer some things from the tools and artifacts early humans left behind, but direct evidence of spoken language from those times is inherently unobservable. Daniel Everett, linguistic and anthropologist, says, we have no direct evidence of the very first human languages. Our understanding is based on the study of existing languages and the application of comparative methods to hypothesize about earlier forms of speech. And Ray Jackendoff, a cognitive scientist in linguistics, says the origins of language lie beyond the reach of direct evidence. The original question, does the evolution of language support human evolution, appears to be a matter of complex debate. However, one can't bear to ask, how can the very scope of a scientific theory, especially one like human evolution, leave empty such a big gap in our development? Ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about the nature of evolution and the evidence to understand it. We've also looked at how the communication of other species relate to those of human beings, what experts have to say about Neanderthals, and nonetheless, why apes can't talk. We attempted to look at the evolution of language based on the first recorded human languages, and lastly, we attempted to answer a question by approaching this topic from a new breath of fresh air. I really do hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please comment down your thoughts, feelings, or emotions. I understand that these topics tend to be very tense, but unless we challenge our beliefs, how can we ever find truth? Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Carlo Castillo, and I'll see you on the next time. Bye-bye.